Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alberto Morales, and I will be presenting on best practices for effective grants cultivation. Before we begin, if you can please mute yourself so we have limited dissonance during the presentation, that would be excellent. Today, we are gathered here today on behalf of the partnership between Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation and BACP, the City of Chicago's Business Affairs and Consumer Protection. It is an honor to work in partnership with both of those organizations. We'll begin with introductions and a welcome, reviewing our objectives for today. Then we'll get into the meat of the presentation, which will cover researching mission-aligned foundation, city, and state grants, ensuring you qualify under their criteria and best practices for those, developing relationships with program officers at the foundation, city, and state offices, preparing your materials for the application, and then follow up with program officers at foundations, city, and state offices. And then we'll share three key takeaways, and then we'll conclude. Let's jump in. A little bit about me. As I mentioned, my name is Alberto Morales. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the founder and CEO of Morales Consulting. We are a national firm that specializes in strategic planning, racial equity facilitation, grant making, program design and evaluation, capacity building, very relevant to today, and project management. I bring extensive experience across the nonprofit, policy, and relevant to today, the philanthropic sector. I previously worked for the Robert R. McCormick Foundation based in Chicago. It's one of the largest foundations here in the Chicagoland region. And I currently have a lot of philanthropic clients that you'll see listed below. Some of them are the United USAID, Chicago Latinos in Philanthropy, the MBA Foundation based in New York, Valley of the Sun United Way, another foundation in Arizona, Lawyers Trust Fund of Illinois, the largest legal aid funder in Illinois, Chicago Scholars, Railroad Tracks Music Academy, Platform of Hope based in DC, LWC Studios based in Maryland, and so many more. So I hope that you feel rest assured that I bring a lot of expertise to today's conversation. And if you're curious to learn more about me and my practice, you can visit us at moralesconsultingllc.com. And on a personal note, I was born and raised in Gage Park on the southwest side of Chicago. I consider myself a Southsider through and through. I studied at Georgetown University for undergrad and received a Master's of Public Affairs from Brown. And rounding out the philanthropic experience, I also am very involved with board involvement. I'm the co-chair of Nuestro Futuro at the Chicago Community Trust, and I'm also on the board of directors for the Albert Pick Fund. So we have three key learning objectives for today. The first one being that we want to develop effective grant cultivation practices. We want to understand the most critical components of the grant sequence to remain competitive and organized throughout, and share resources to begin researching mission aligned grants. So let's begin. At the highest level, the following is a 5-step process, which is going to cover the sequence for effective grant cultivation. At the furthest left, you will begin with researching mission-aligned foundations, city and state grants. You'll then move to the second quadrant on the right that will ensure you qualify under their criteria. So you'll review your budget, size, and ensure that it qualifies, your nonprofit status, the issue area to the grant that you're seeking, and so much more we'll cover. And then the third, once you do that, you'll move on is you'll begin to develop relationships with program officers at foundations, city, and state offices if possible. We'll walk through what that means. And then once all of those three steps are in place, you'll prepare your applications for your materials for the application. And then finally, you'll follow up with program officers at the foundation, city, and state office. So step one is research mission aligned foundations, city, and state grants. This is the hardest part of the process because you have to identify mission aligned grants to apply to. And it's the most confusing and overwhelming. I understand that. But the most important part of the grants cultivation sequence that we just went through, because it will save you considerable time down the road by investing the heavy lifting right in the beginning. So, what do we mean by mission aligned? grants that align to your organization's core focus. We will cover this more in the next section related to the criteria, but I can't stress enough how you should spend a lot of time in this part of the grant sequence because it is so critical that you spend your time researching before investing in filling out an application because it might not fit be with your mission and your criteria. So you avoid spending so much time way down the road that you would have wasted by front loading it now. And I would recommend that you create an internal tracking system to monitor your progress of all of the grants that you're currently thinking of applying to so you can meet the deadlines, identify the points of contact, identify the websites, and any follow up necessary. And you're probably asking yourself, what software should I use for that internal tracking system for the grants? Well, the good news is that you don't have to invest a lot of money in expensive software yet. And there's so many free grant tracking templates online. You can literally Google free grants tracking templates and you will get so many different ones. Find whatever works best for your brain, for your organization, for your team, and just use it. As long as it works for you, that's what's most important. And as long as it keeps you on track to meet deadlines and organize, that is the most important. But I highly recommend that after the research, you begin laying those out in this internal tracking system. And the next stage is ensuring that you qualify for those grants under their criteria, which we'll cover in the next section. But before that, there's this catch 22, right? Well, how do I begin identifying foundation grants if I've never applied to either a foundation, city, or state grant? Where do I even begin? Great question. So, here I've outlined a few great places for you to start. The first one is Forefront. If you're not familiar with Forefront, they're Illinois' statewide association that represents both grant makers, so foundations, and nonprofits, as well as their advisors and allies. So, um, while if there's a benefit to becoming a member, you don't necessarily have to pay right away to access the resources. You can sign up for their newsletter. You can look through their website and see what foundation partners are listed, and you'll immediately get a huge litany of foundations and opportunities for grants to apply to. So that's one. If you want a more national and international reach that's not just Illinois focused, because you're focused on diversifying your funding, then you can look also to Candid. They have a national and international foundation directory that is available to you for your review. And then, of course, relevant to today, the city of Chicago has excellent grant opportunities. And the way that I would recommend that you start monitoring and tracking those is by constantly reviewing their websites and announcements and create a list of the ones that you most qualify for and check weekly and sign up for their newsletters because they update the website on a recurring basis. You then want another relevant one is the charitable trust, which is based out of the office of the Illinois Treasurer, and it helps small nonprofits across the state of Illinois. So some examples that they grant out for are food programs, housing, workforce development, economic development. So please sign up for their listserv and search through those websites as well. Um, Subsequently, there's also the Illinois Department of Human Services, and they have a ton of great grants available for your review and consideration. So please check out that website. And then finally, another resource that's very valuable, and I would highly recommend that you sign up for their newsletter, is AMP Chicago. They're a capacity building program for Black and Latina led and or serving nonprofits. So please do sign up for their newsletter. They have a ton of amazing capacity building resources and they are often sharing grants. So I share those to help build your confidence and a good place to start, knowing that this is not an extensive reach, but a good place to start. So, as mentioned before, the second part of the sequence is ensuring that you qualify under their criteria. So, every foundation, city, and state office has their own requirements. Excuse me, dry throat. For applying for their grants. And this can make the process overwhelming to manage and underscores the importance. Excuse me, wow. It's really dry in this room right now. Give me 1 second. And this can make the process very overwhelming to manage and underscores the importance of the grant making tracking system to help manage your due diligence and timelines, right? So in that grant tracker, you can specify which criteria they have and if you have the checklist, right? So that's an easy way for you to stay organized under the grants tracker. So after creating that list of foundations that include not only foundations but city and state grants. Um, you also want to individually research their grant making cycles and application requirements and criteria so you don't end up wasting your time. And that grant tracker will allow you to stay organized. Okay, so what's the deadline? What is their grant making cycle? What is their criteria? Do I qualify? Yes, check. And some common criteria that they will screen for are the following: budget size, nonprofit status, program model and goals, geographic focus, population focus, audited financials in 990, and then a board of directors. So you want to start getting all of that information ready in order, but also make sure that you qualify because often size will have budget size requirements. They'll have program model requirements. They'll have a geo focus. So please do screen accordingly so you don't end up wasting your time later down the road. So once you do that, you did the heavy lifting. You did the research. You also organized that research into your grants tracker. And then you've identified that you do qualify under their criteria because you've spent time doing your due diligence. So now is the exciting part of actually developing relationships with program officers. And if you're not too familiar with what and who a program officer is, essentially think about the program officer being someone that is your point of contact between your organization and their organization and the grant. They are your strongest ally between the possibility of receiving a grant because they are tasked with reviewing your application and making recommendation to their senior leadership and or board. So in the highest level, successful grant cultivation requires a balance of formal grant writing and also traditional fundraising approaches that include relationship building. So, grant writing and submission is actually the final step of the process to successful grants cultivation. As I outlined in the sequence, it's not the first step. And this is so important. Ideally, before you apply to a foundation, city, and or state grant, you will have touch based at least once and discuss your proposal with that program officer in that foundation or city or state office. And this is actually a must do, particularly for foundation grants. And it will likely increase your chances of moving forward along their grant making cycle because they understand the nuances of your program, your nonprofit, and the leadership at the table. And if you develop these relationships with a program officer, they will also be your internal advocates and liaisons between their board who approve the grants. They'll be able to talk about your application with a little bit more nuance because you will have provided that context in that introduction conversation and follow-up meetings, hopefully, to outline your proposal. So make sure you add funder touch points and communication to your grants tracker and keep track of those moving pieces so it doesn't become overwhelming. So add a column and say when was the last touch point with this program officer and any necessary follow up. So how do you develop relationships with program officers is probably your next logical question. And I would say there are four quick steps to think about as a framework for developing these relationships with your program officer. The first one is research. Identify the strongest connection to your program officer. Do you know somebody on their staff or board for that specific foundation, for that specific department, or that they have an existing relationship and leverage that for introduction. So always use your closest link to that person, to that organization as an introduction. And if not, that's okay. Oftentimes they're very open to cold call emails and are actually very excited to speak to potential applicants. So also try to attend any webinars that these organizations host and learn as much as you can about their grant making process and then use that as a springboard for the conversation. So then after you identify the point of contact and have a facilitated introduction, hopefully, or you yourself reach out, you want to develop a targeted and personalized communication to that program officer and contact them very early in the process. And you also want to prepare for that meeting, and we'll talk about this in the next page. So then after you cultivate that relationship, you stay in touch, you follow the program officer's lead on the funding level that they recommend for the grant. And then also the content and the timing. Again, they are your best advocate and will position you best for funding. They know the organization best and will be able to position you well. And then finally, you follow up with a thank you email and you remain interested and authentically engaged throughout the grant making cycle. So it's a balance of checking in and also not annoying the program officer too much. So you'll know how to manage that relationship well, and I trust that you will. So congratulations, you secured a meeting with the program officer. Now what? You do want to prepare a PowerPoint with an overview of your program that includes timelines, staffing, and goals. You do want to attend with the closest relationship to the organization. So if your board member or a senior leader was the one who facilitated that introduction to that person, be sure that they're in the room. You want to prepare to answer any questions related to your program and your nonprofit, particularly if there's any red flags like any deficits in previous 990s. You don't want to end up with surprises. So please be prepared. Research the organization, whether it's the foundation, city, or state office, and demonstrate your interest in partnership. And don't forget to follow up and remain in touch. Excuse me. Don't provide overwhelming detail. Avoid burying the program officer in the minutia of your program. Only share high level and important information necessary for them to understand the intricacies of your program and and have that buy-in, but don't overwhelm them with detail. Show up unprepared. Please don't do that, or without a PowerPoint, or then don't wait last minute to contact that program officer, or cold call. Email is fine, but don't actually pick up the phone and call a program officer if you don't have an existing relationship previously. So here I outline some helpful resources for relationship building with program officers that go into further detail for the framework that I just covered. Uh, while some of them are a little bit outdated, the general best practices still apply to the current day. And I highly encourage you to review these articles, and that way you're well prepared for developing those relationships with your program officers. So great. Now we've advanced to the next phase of the sequence for effective grants cultivation. It's phase four, the actual preparing of the materials for submission. So believe it or not, you've done the hardest part of the grants cultivation process. You have researched, you've identified organization leads, and you've connected with program officers and hopefully gotten a green light to submit an application for funding. And from my experience, both with clients, with my experience at the McCormick Foundation, and now sitting on a few boards related to philanthropy, the applications that I have evaluated follow some of these best practices for their applications that they submit. They are concise, they're well written, there's no grammar mistakes, and they're easy to read. So they're well organized. Two, they're realistic with what they're proposing they want to achieve with the grants. They there's a balance between the grant goals being ambitious but then also realistic, right? So you believe that they will be able to carry the work and that they're not going to get burnt out or under achieve their expectations. They have strong outcomes and they highlight previous successes that demonstrate their effectiveness. They are mission aligned, as we talked about earlier. The program components and initiatives complement the foundation, city, or state grants priorities. There's also strong diversity of staff and board and the diverse populations that they serve. Their financials are strong and they provide evidence by their audited financials and or 990s. There's an existing relationship there. It's not the first time I'm learning about the organization because there's been a previous conversation because they've shown interest in reaching out. And leadership, they have a strong executive director, senior leaders, and board. So you've never submitted a grant, don't be intimidated. There's so many plenty of resources for you to leverage for writing your first grant. Turn to peers for support and ask them for a copy of their previous grant submissions. Hire a grant writer and or consultant to support you in drafting your first grant application. Take a grant writing course and or class and learn some of these best practices that I just outlined in the previous page and how to format them accordingly so you build a story that flows well and highlights your accomplishments. And there's also plenty of free resources online that you can also tap into. So you don't have to necessarily pay online or pay for a consultant. You can also do the heavy lifting yourself if you have the capacity to, and look up the free grant proposals and templates and practices online. So please don't be intimidated. There's a lot of help to help you secure that grant. So great. You now moved on to phase five, which is the final step of the grant sequence, which is following up with program officers. If you haven't heard back in a while after submitting your grant proposal, that's okay. There's a good reason why you have a relationship now established with a program officer. Write them an email and check in about the status of your proposal and ask if they would like to set up another meeting to learn more about your program or if they have any follow up questions. It's a great opportunity to remind them of your interest in partnership. But remember, it is a sensitive threshold between following up and also knowing your program officers. So don't check in every day or every week about the status of your grant application. You will actually alienate the relationship you've worked so hard to cultivate because they are so busy reviewing hundreds, if not thousands, of grants. And a gentle nudge is merited uh, with a balanced approach. So, over the course of the grant cycle, you will likely be asked for a site visit to dive more deeply into your organization and program. This is the best sign that you're on track to receive a grant. Not all organizations require this, so don't be shocked if it, or disappointed if you don't get asked for a site visit. It just depends on the culture, the staffing capacity of the foundation, of the city and or state office. But most foundations that you apply to will require this. So I share with you three key takeaways that I want to highlight before we conclude. Number one, have a grants tracking tool system in place to help you stay organized to meet deadlines and milestones and any follow ups. Research and prioritize mission aligned foundations, city and state grants, and invest a lot of time in this front loading part of the process. Relationships are critical to the grants cultivation sequence. please touch base with the program officers if you can and use the closest link to that foundation, to that city and or state office to learn more about how you can get that introduction. And if you don't, that's okay. At least you tried, knowing that that's a really integral part of the grant cultivation sequence. So with that, I conclude, and I thank you so much for your time. And if you have any follow-up questions, please do be sure to reach out to the Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation and stay in touch with the City of Chicago's Business Affairs and Consumer Protection. We are here to support you and build your capacity and hopefully cultivate additional grants for your growing nonprofit. Thank you so much for being here. Norma, do we have time for questions? Dale, please jump in. Can you please drop it in the chat? Yes, the slides will absolutely be made available to you after the presentation. Ms. Sanders will follow up with the slides. And this webinar is also recorded, so it will be available for your rewatch. And then in the follow-up, you will have the links to those specific resources, articles, grants that I outlined. Thanks for that question, Dale. Is there a basic tracking system you recommend for beginners? As I mentioned earlier, you don't have to pay for an expensive software as long as you can either even create your own, but if you don't want to create your own, you can find some readily available online for free. So download those, and as I mentioned, as long as it helps you stay on track, meet deadlines and follow up and screen for your criteria, that's all it's intended to do. So don't invest a lot in that grant tracking system. Create your own if you can in the beginning, see how it works, and if it works for you, continue using that, or create your own after you find the template online. Gerald, do you have any questions for the group? Can you drop your question in the chat, Gerald? Thank you, Dale. I appreciate that feedback. Gerald, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can drop your... Oh, there it is. Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. I gained a wealth of information and look forward to putting into what was shared. Thanks again. Oh, well, thank you so much, Gerald. I greatly appreciate that feedback as well. Thank you both for being here. Well, I know we're almost at time, so I will give you guys 4 minutes back to your busy schedule. So thank you again for joining us. And please do stay in touch. There's an excellent webinars coming up. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.